The worn cover of the book reads, Commonwealth of Virginia Department of Highways Level Book, 1958. The time book was used to record workers' hours, but when you thumb through its yellowed pages, crinkled from years of use in the kitchen, several outdated coupons flutter out, along with obituaries and marriage announcements. The scent of cloves drift up from those pages where a recipe for Russian tea, used every Christmas for the past 40 years, is recorded in the proud handwriting of my great-grandmother, Ethel Stanley Russell. I flipped through its pages countless times, but never before took notice of how much family history is nestled there, among dishes like sinful salad and peanut butter balls. The first line, captured in Mama's careful script, is, her injury is 75 to 80% healed. I wonder whose injury it was and what caused it, amused by the confident statistic describing the woman's health. I imagine Mama sitting at the kitchen table, recording this fact as she listened to the story's narrator over the telephone. Over the years, recipes were added one by the rest of us. The blend of our handwriting in the book is much like a recipe in itself. Granny's handwriting is much like Mama's, sweeping, slanting, with careful loops, unpretentious and warm. My mother's writing is tiny and delicate like lace. Then there's the large, looping handwriting of children, who were given the grown-up job of recording a recipe if adult hands were covered in flour. Arthritis remedy, Mama wrote somewhere near the back of the book, where she promised that 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, honey, and apple cider vinegar boiled together and taken before each meal would heal aching joints. Embedded between recipes for the holidays, she had included this piece of timeless advice. Keep 4-foot roofing shingles in your car. If caught in a snowdrift or ice, put under wheels for 8 feet of traction rough side up. Though she never got a driver's license, Mama always looked out for advice to dispense to the drivers in the family. What makes the recipes most interesting is that each is dated, and each time a recipe was added to the book, Mama indicated who had given her the recipe and the date on which the person had visited. For most of them, she added her personal critique in parenthesis. Real good. Welcome to Southern Salon Podcast. I'm Amy Clark Spain.
And I'm Brittany Robertson.
And we're glad you're with us. So, Brittany, this is an essay that I wrote about my great-grandmother and our family recipes a long time ago. And since we're talking about food and recipes and homesteading today, I dug it out, and it's such a pleasure to read that and remember the memories. It's just like when you open a recipe book and the scent of all of the foods that you've made float up. It's kind of like the memories work that way.
You know, Amy, it was so funny as you were reading that. That's actually the first time that I heard that, and it was absolutely beautiful. But as you were reading that, I swear, my granny's got a book that's just like that, and I could smell the pages of that book, and I could hear everything that you were saying as if it were coming from my own family. So that was absolutely beautiful and reminded me so much of my own granny and she kept hers in a tin box, and the smell of that tin box and opening that up is just unbelievable. And I think you brought all those memories back to me just now.
On your Instagram page, you blogged about recipes recently and how they sort of function as heirlooms. And I think, growing up in Appalachia, growing up in a rural community especially, this isn't exclusive to rural communities. There's so much more to food preparation and food culture and recipes, I think particularly for women than in other places. Do you think that's true? I mean, you talked about framing recipes and preserving them that way. What do they mean for you and your family?
First of all, I think it's something that you don't appreciate until you're older. I think about all the times maybe when I was younger and I would have been in my granny's kitchen or with my mom cooking, and I didn't pay attention like I should have, and I didn't appreciate the value of those things. But, my great-grandmother passed away when I was 5, and so this is my connection to her now, as a mom myself and cooking for my family, looking at her old recipes and imagining how she fixed them with the most simple ingredients. Oleo was the most common ingredient in anything that she made, but they were just simple, fuss-free ingredients. And, I know we've evolved into a Pinterest world and I'm not knocking Pinterest. I absolutely love it and get most of my recipes from there. But there's something about the handwritten recipes in that tin box that are just so simplistic, but for me, they taste like home. And I imagine them coming from a time period when we weren't worried about, how pretty our food looked or how many ingredients that it had. We were worried about being able to feed our families with it.
They did manage to make it look so pretty. I mean, there's nothing prettier in my mind than canned food, especially something like beets or peppers, how beautiful they can be in a mason jar. I just think it's a work of art. We know that food can be art, and even though they did it mostly to be functional, I'm thinking about, my mama's soup beans or her molasses cake or German chocolate cake, which is one of the things in that recipe book that we make every Christmas. And I think every family has their stock recipes that they use, for certain holidays. Ours was, and still is, Russian tea at Christmas. We always have a pot of it going. We start making it the day before, or a couple of days before the holiday, and we have it going through the whole holiday. And people just come and they dip their cups in it, and it's sort of like coffee. It's like you come in and you have your Russian tea. We make Mama's German chocolate cake. It's like you're bringing the people you lost back to life, sort of in those recipes and those smells and those tastes. It's such a good feeling.
That's the perfect way of explaining that. That is what we're doing when we're fixing those things. It's being able to bring back a piece of the people that we've lost. I've never had Russian tea, but you're making me want to try that. Ours is definitely, my mom makes an Italian cream cheesecake. That was my granny's recipe. And I mean, you can never go wrong with homemade rolls. And that's usually one of the things that we have as well. So we also have our broccoli casserole at most of our big family gatherings. So I think that is a way of connecting yourself to the people that you lost. And, if you think about food, maybe it's this way for me, but food is kind of the ultimate comfort for me. Whenever I am traveling or if we've been on vacation for a while, we've been eating out a lot or we've been around restaurants that we aren't familiar with, the first thing I want to do when I come home is get a big batch of garden food, especially in the summer, and just eat home food, as I call it, and because it's peaceful and it's comforting and it reminds you of just simplistic, mealtime and home. So, thing I wanted to touch on, which I think is so ironic, my granny kept her canned goods in a cellar. It wasn't pretty, wasn't decorated. It had dirt floors, walls just were filled with shelves, and it was built outside of their home into the ground. And I think about my canned food now. When I do can, I keep things in my basement on a shelf, but I also bring them up and put them in a glass cabinet to display because I think they're beautiful. And it's funny how maybe that has changed. I doubt that it was used as a decorative piece back when my granny was doing it, but for some reason now I feel compelled to show mine as if it's a connection to my past or if it's a connection to my relatives and the comforting food that we served as a family.
My mama had a root cellar much like that was half built into the hillside. And I can still remember opening the door and seeing the jars lined up on the shelf and how pretty they were when the sunlight hit them. They really are beautiful. And I think that whole tradition of canning that just made me remember something about the kitchen as this space where it wasn't just about food preparation. Some of my best memories are when the women in my family were canning or freezing. That was a special occasion. You got together to put up your garden and just listening to their stories as they were doing the work, right, of canning and freezing was so much fun. Just listening to that while I was learning. And you were talking about the cellar and canning in my house. And I know I talk a lot about the old house that we live in. It was built in the 1930s. I found in the basement, there's a row of shelves, and I found inside the doors of the canning cabinet that was built when the house was built by the first owner. Her name was Margaret. She had left a record of all of the canning that she had done starting around 1943. And so it's this paper. The inside of the canning door is papered, and it's in her script, and it's mostly in pencil from 1943 to 1951. And it's a record of all of the fruits and all of the vegetables and how much she canned. And I like to go down there and visit that space and read, and her handwriting. It's sort of like a historical artifact to me. It's so interesting. I move around this house sometimes in my quiet moments, and I look at things that we haven't changed, and I think about, and that's one of them. And I think about the fact that she did that during wartime, during World War II, she was doing that. And after, and all of the things that were happening in her life and all of the things that were happening in the world, what she must have been thinking about as she was preparing and canning and freezing. And, we're going through something right now that's driving people to think about homesteading more and think about growing their own food and preserving their own food. And I think about her, and I think then it was more common to grow your own food and put up your own food. We didn't have the conveniences that we have now, but was she afraid of running out of food, for example? I know things were rationed, and that had to be kind of scary for her. That's such a treasure in our basement, that space and that canning cabinet and her handwriting.
I told Amy that that's something that I'm going to do the next time I'm at her house, is go check that out, because I think that the story behind that sounds beautiful. And Amy was talking about when she was telling me the story about how her handwriting had started deteriorating towards the end. And I just thought that was so sweet and so special. And it's kind of a look back into how things were when things were simpler. You were concerned about taking care of your family and feeding your family. And I think that was very evident in what she was doing. So, another thing that this quarantine time has really kind of showed me is the importance of being able to take care of yourself and to can and to preserve your food. So what I learned as a hobby, watching my mom and my grandparents do, has now kind of turned into a way that I'm able to try to support and have a food stock for my family. I am by no means an expert, and I'm totally learning as I go, but being able to pull out a jar of green beans fresh from the summer in the middle of wintertime and eat is something that it's kind of addictive and something that I'm learning to love to do. So each year I'm trying a few extra little things. And this year I've done freezer strawberry jam. And when some more of the fruits come in, I'm going to try some other fruits. And, really it's just a trial and error process. It's something that I'm trying to teach my daughter, and again, I think it's ironic because it started out as a hobby. And then this last year, it really became something that I saw as important to help, to be able to provide for my family and, to not have to rely on grocery stores and things like that, to be able to have some things put away that we could pull out and use. Starting to see the benefit of having that ability to preserve your own food and to connect with your own food. And, you don't have to have a garden. That's the other thing. I am growing a garden this year, but last year and the year before I did not, and I still canned quite a bit. You can go to a farmer's market or a farm stand and load up on some of the goodies there. And
planting by the signs and harvesting by the signs. This is something that we grew up hearing about and doing. When I did my doctoral dissertation, this was something that I studied. I interviewed women in Appalachia to see how much they used it. And one thing I didn't realize was that people don't just plant by the signs. They do other things by the signs. And I think I've mentioned this before, but there are two places that this comes from. It's sort of people that aren't from around here. There's a verse in the Bible. There's a verse in Genesis 1:44 that says, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let it be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." Being an agricultural region, a lot of things are governed by the weather, and we read the weather signs. Red skies in the morning, sailors take warning. Red skies at night, sailors delight. We know what's going to bring bad weather and what's going to bring good weather. And that's important when you're growing food, when you're growing crops. That's very, very old. But people also use the zodiac calendar. But there's this series of books called the Foxfire Books, and it's a collection of oral histories that were collected in the 1970s in Rabun County, Georgia. And anything you want to know about homesteading is in this series of books. These high school kids, and I mean, they're amazing books, and they're still being sold. Everything from how to build a cabin to how to slaughter livestock to how to make they captured everything they could possibly capture in these books. And so it talks about the zodiac signs and how each day of a planting calendar includes the sign that rules it based on the constellation related to that sign. And I don't know how much people around here go by that, but they do talk about signs being in the head or the breast or the feet. So like, for example, My grandmother, in her recipe book, she wrote that onions should be harvested in the full dark of the moon or they'll rot. And that means that you should pull up your onions in July when the sun is high or in the breast, not low, to risk spoiling the food. Does that sound familiar to you?
It does, but you know way more about that than I do. That's really interesting. Honestly, something I need to pay a little more attention to. I feel like my granny, and when I hear my mama talk about it, they talk about planning by the signs in terms of, what the Farmer's Almanac
Yes,
says.
I was going to say, people use the Farmer's
Have
Almanac.
you heard it from that perspective too, Amy?
I know a lot of people that use it religiously, and that governs how they plan out their planting and harvesting.
What I think is so neat about that is my mama and even my neighbor, she does a lot of canning and a lot of like food preservation. And she talks about it. And I mean, it's religion, truth. I can't plant my beans until the sign's right. Well, Big Brittany here got the grand idea that, well, I'm not going to wait. I want early vegetables this year. So I planted corn and beans, tomatoes, squash, and peppers about 3 weeks ago. And wouldn't you know that we had the coldest snap we've had in a long time last weekend. So I was out there at 9:00 at night covering up, looked like Uncle Eddie off of, in my bathrobe off of National Lampoon's Vacation, covering up my tomatoes with buckets and plastic and everything else. So I need to pay more attention to those signs.
We know we're going to have these winters, these little winters like dogwood winter and blackberry winter, and we're just coming out of one now. Thank goodness it's going to be warm today. But you don't know when the frost is going to end. And I saw people on Facebook talking about that. They had to dig up their plants and move them indoors or, because they thought it was over and it came back around again. So there was another little story that I remember that this woman told me about pickling, for example, like pickled beans and kraut and things like that. And she said, you always make it when the signs are high, like in the head or the arms. Because if you make them low, when the signs are in the bowels or the feet, they will go bad. And, this is a cause-effect relationship that people have figured out. We don't know why it works. It just does. They know from cause-effect over the years that if they do it when the signs are low, they'll have to throw it out. It's going to rot. It's not going to grow. The brine will go down and they'll spoil, she said. I'm looking at my interview notes right now, or they'll be too soft. But another thing that they told me was that they don't just plant by the signs. Like if they have to have any kind of dental work done, or if they want to wean their children, they did that by the signs because it worked out better. You heal better, apparently. People behave better. It's fascinating.
I've heard that too, which again, when you say it out loud, it kind of sounds silly, but I know people that live by that and swear by it. And I feel like the times that I have listened and obeyed, it's been spot on. So there is definitely something beyond that. So, one of the things that Amy and I had planned on talking about this is talking about gardening and planting our own food and things like that, and what it teaches our kids about the process of food and being able to have that kind of that satisfaction of growing food yourself, and that's a part of the quote unquote homeschool, which by the way, Amy has gone from Mary Poppins the first week. She's the, drawing a blank.
Too.
She's the headmaster in Annie. I've gone downhill pretty sharply in my homeschooling, but one of the things I am doing, Miss Hannigan, I've gone from Mary Poppins to Miss Hannigan, but one of the things that I am doing is, we did do a garden and not huge, but just enough to kind of teach my kids too. And so that's been some of their lesson is planning it and understanding how we're taking care of it. And I hope this is probably the first year that they're going to all be old enough to kind of understand it, what that satisfaction brings from being able to plan it, to eat it at your dinner table. So I'm really excited about that and hopefully kind of instilling some of that purpose in their minds. The thing about it is, and I know Amy can vouch for this too, there are so many plants that you could literally throw in a pot and put on your porch and grow. I'm doing my own little herb garden on my porch this year, and I'm using a galvanized beverage dispenser from Walmart. And I've got cilantro and basil and oregano and parsley, spearmint.
What have you found grows? I know tomatoes will grow well on a deck. What else have you found? And strawberry. I've not been able to grow strawberries very well in a pot, but What have you found that grows well in a pot?
Honestly, my soil here in my garden is not very good, and I think tomatoes are very finicky. So I've done tomatoes on my porch, and I've done them in a pot, as long as they've got a lot of sunlight. I've done herbs on a pot, just depending on how big, really and truly, you could take kind of square planters and, as long as they have, ample sunlight, you can put them on the steps. That's one thing I do is I have 5 or 6 steps that go up to my porch, and I have little pots on each step. And you could even do onions in those, probably some trailing cucumbers. Tomatoes sticks out to me because we eat a lot of tomatoes.
As cucumbers will grow so fast. They will grow so fast. They'll grow overnight. They'll be like little one night, and then the next night you go out and they're too big. But we made a trellis and we trained them up. So they were sort of hanging down. And I didn't know if that would work, but if you catch them before they get too big, I don't know if you've ever tried that. I just wanted them up off the ground, and it works. I think I saw it on Pinterest, but
that's a great idea.
I just have to make sure that I catch them before they get too big because I get lazy about picking my produce. I get really lazy about that, and it's way too big before I catch it, or it's rotting before I catch it.
I do
but
too.
No, this year's going to be an experiment. I'm assuming with your herb garden, for example, you drill holes in the bottom of your bucket, right? You have to have drainage. Do you put pebbles in there too, or just the soil?
No, I just did soil, but you could probably do that. I just did soil straight through. If there are some listeners who've really never gardened before or, preserve their food, I wanted Amy to share some of her picks for easy beginning gardening. We
always grow a variety. We grow the little ones, the Roma tomatoes, and then we grow the beefsteak tomatoes. We haven't had much luck with we had luck with green beans one year, but I think they need more space. One of the things, if you do a box garden or a small garden, you have to be careful about how much you plant. We get excited and we plant too much. And if you plant too much and it all gets tangled up together, it just won't turn out well. That's been a mistake that we've made a couple of times, particularly with squash, cucumbers, things like that. Viney things will grow together and tangle up and rot, and they just don't like being together. They don't play well together. So you have to be careful about training them up or training them away from each other. So I would say tomatoes. I think squash is pretty easy to grow. We've grown peppers. Green peppers especially seem to do well for us. And as far as I'm going to try the herbs this year, I keep lavender in pots all over my deck to sort of keep bugs and mosquitoes at bay. And I just love how it smells. And that's something that came back. I sort of let it go when winter came, and it has just come back up in the pots on its own, which is great. I don't have to go out and buy more lavender. It just sort of came back.
Well, that excites me about lavender because this is my first time ever growing lavender. And so I bought it just purely for the smell. So I'm excited to hear that it came back up. Raised bed gardening is becoming really popular. And I have a friend who has some phenomenal raised beds, and she grows everything in hers. She has 3 or 4 big beds, and she's got potatoes. And, potatoes are a really easy one because you plant them and you kind of forget about them, honestly. If you have some space or a little bit of space, corn has always done really well for us. I've done beans. Green beans are one of my favorite foods. And so I do those every year, and I stagger their growth, or I stagger my planting. So I'll plant some one week, and then a week later I'll plant more, just to kind of stagger the amount of time or stagger when they start coming in. Green beans, really a lot of the ones that Amy named, I'm going to have to take tomato notes from her because my tomatoes are the most finicky things in the world. But squash, zucchini, green peppers, all of those things are pretty easy to go with. Onions as well. I tried broccoli one year and it was a mess. It was just filled with worms. So I haven't done broccoli again in a while. But some really quick things that I do as far as canning and things that are great for beginners. Canning most of the time requires some kind of pressure cooking. I do can green beans and I can tomatoes. Maybe we'll do a podcast where we talk a little bit more about that process. But I also do freezer corn, which requires no canning whatsoever. And it's so good. Again, you do not have to have a garden. You can I go to a local farm and buy a bag, like a big satchel, I guess you could say, of corn when all the corn starts coming in. And that's what I use to freeze. And so I just shuck it, and then I cut all the kernels off with a knife, boil it up in a pot, just just kind of heat it up with some milk and some butter and some salt and pepper. And there is few things in this world I like better than freezer corn. And I just freeze it in bags so that I can dump it out during the winter time and we can have fresh corn. Also tried freezer jam for the first time this year with strawberries, and it was really good and really easy to make. I'm going to try peaches. I might even try some blackberries this year. I'm just, at this point, it's kind of, again, it's trial and error, learning how to do it and trying it out and seeing what works for you. But I would definitely recommend, if you've never done it, to maybe start small with some pots on your porch, or maybe start with a small raised bed garden.
What I can't grow, I would like to get from a farmer's market, but I don't know. I don't know how that's going to affect people's ability to sell their produce. I hope it doesn't. Maybe we can social distance and wear masks and things and still do it and make it work. This is still ongoing. I know that states are sort of easing up on restrictions and people are getting out more, and they will as the weather. I think this is a good thing for your mental health too, and your physical health. It's good to get outside and work with your hands and get in the dirt and grow something and see progress. I think that's one of the important things that kids learn about gardening, is that you can make something happen with tender love and care, and you can see it grow, and you can see this full cycle, right? From farm to your fork, you can see this whole thing and have the satisfaction of knowing that you did it. So it's not just something that will give you food. I think it's something that'll give you an outlet and help with any stress you may be feeling or any anxiety that you may be feeling.
Well, and that's the very reason that I'm doing it this year. I didn't grow a garden last year, and we're back in it this year. I think some of it is because it's a feeling of satisfaction, and it's kind of a feeling of control. So I did strawberry freezer jam, and I shared my recipe for that, which is not mine. I just used the back of the Sure-Gel box, or the insert in the Sure-Gel box that tells you how to do it. I also recently just shared a biscuit recipe without buttermilk. So I'm hoping, as I have a little more time to kind of cook, that I can start sharing a few more of the things that I've been doing.
Be sure to check out our Instagram page, Southern Salon Podcast, because we're going to share some more interesting recipes. And I have a few books that I'd like to share with you, some of my favorite books that are written in recipes, that my favorite authors who talk about their families and their favorite recipes, Rick Bragg, Lee Smith, and Adriana Trigiani. So be sure and go there and follow us there. And this has been fun.
Bye-bye.